Hello, hello. Welcome to the hot month of July. Yes, it is July and it is warming up here in the DMV area. I'm happy to be with you tonight on this hot evening. My name is Stephanie Lomax, your HR in the Dark podcast host, where we uncover and discuss the dark side of HR and issues that arise and come to the light when we've been keeping them in the dark way too long. So we expose that dark side of HR. And I'm also your resident HR strategist and subject matter expert in the world of alphabet soup, as we all know as human resources. I am excited to be here with you this evening. Speaking of hot, we have a really hot topic this evening. We are talking about marijuana and the workplace. I don't want to say marijuana in the workplace because it really is not only in the workplace, but it's affecting everything that happens in and around the workplace. So it really is, marrying these two things together. What I can tell you is that this isn't really anything new. In doing research for the podcast, I found some very interesting information, and I'm happy to share it with you this evening so we can kind of unpack this thing and get you guys on the right path to understanding how to navigate marijuana and your workplace and your organization. So let's go ahead and get to it. I'm stealing from Chris Cuomo. Let's jump right in. All right. So let me give you a little bit of history and timeline here. So there are things that happen just like with prohibition, right? Although prohibition was way earlier than this. But there were things that were taking place in the early 1900s as it related to, back then they were calling it Indian hemp. And there were states and the federal legislation, of course, battling with it, but it really was on a much smaller scale. I mean, let's be honest, our population was much smaller, and it really wasn't something that was as prevalent specifically as it related to workplace conditions. But in 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was actually passed, and that prohibited cannabis at the federal level. Now, there was still some use that was permitted for medicinal purposes, but the legislation was so tight that it really made even medical use of cannabis, marijuana, difficult to do. So the Marijuana Tax Act is kind of where this really started to gain attention of legislation on a federal level, to the point where it became really more of a topic that people started to discuss. In 1970, the Controlled Substance Act was passed. Now, the Controlled Substance Act of 1970 prohibited any use at all. So then what happened over those, 43 years, 33 years, over that period of time? I mean, we had what was it? The Flower Child movement that occurred. And we had a lot of kind of, recreational things happening, but it was still illegal on the federal level, even though people were saying that they were using it for their cataracts and stuff like that. So you had that taking place, in between 1937 and 1970, and probably some other things as well. But the Controlled Substance Act is what prohibited any use at all. So medicinal use of marijuana came off the table in 1970. But in 1973, just 3 very short years later, Oregon became the first state to decriminalize the use of marijuana with a $100 fine. Now, we know that that's the case now, right, in a lot of states, and we're going to get to that in just a second. But Oregon was the very first state to do that. It stayed that way with multiple states following Oregon's suit from 1973 through 1982. Then there was a little bit of a kind of a hiatus where things kind of died down a little bit. There were other major drug problems happening that were coming to the forefront. We had heroin that took place. We had crack. We had cocaine. There was a lot of other things that were really taking media and legal attention, I guess you could say, away from marijuana. It became, yes, we knew it was illegal, and there were some states that had decriminalized it, but, as far as most people were concerned, it was still an illegal substance. And as of today, on a federal level, it still is an illegal substance, but we'll jump into that in a second. So then in 1996, California becomes the first state to legalize medical use of marijuana. And up until 2012, there were states that followed suit doing the same thing. So kind of California paved the way to kind of reverse this Controlled Substance Act and kind of go back to this Marijuana Tax Act that happened in 1930s, right? But then in 2012, what happened? Colorado and Washington State become the first states to legalize recreational use of marijuana. And now here we are 7 years later in 2019. 8 years ago, so just in 2011, so we just finished talking about, Colorado and Washington State being the first two states to legalize recreational use, right? So come back one more year in 2011, medical use in 17 states and DC was allowed, okay? Just in eight years ago. But there was no recreational use. Now today, I just told you two states, right? Colorado and Washington State, right? 33 states now allow medical use of marijuana. 10 states plus DC allow recreational use and or have decriminalized it to some degree. So there are some states that have also kind of a mixed bag of what they will and will not allow, I guess, in terms of recreational use versus medicinal use, and then those that have completely legalized it across the board. So this really puts, it sheds a new light on a lot of things. I think it says a lot about where we are as a country in terms of being progressive, if I can use that word loosely, right? So where we are in terms of what we think about drug use to some degree, right? I think it also speaks to how things just kind of evolve. So again, in the beginning, I was talking about the Prohibition era, and alcohol and moonshine and all those things that were prohibited, and how laws passed and they put age limits on it when you could, when legally allowed to drink and things like that. So I just kind of see the same pattern taking place with marijuana use. And so it puts employers and organizations in quite an interesting position, because for many years, human resources professionals like myself would go into or work with organizations, or were in an organization where, we were working through drug-free workplace policies, which included alcohol, but it's on a different scale. But we were working with, with the organizations that we were either employed by or we were consulting with about how to put together these drug-free workplace policies, which include, oftentimes, if they're a full-fledged drug-free workplace policy, it includes pre-employment testing, it includes random testing, it includes probable cause testing, reasonable suspicion testing, post-accident testing. There's like 5 or 6 things that this pre-employment this drug-free workplace policy program would include in terms of testing. And of course, we didn't, many of the organizations that I worked with, the alcohol was included in that, but we did not test for alcohol as pre-employment tests. But however, if someone had an accident or we were reasonably suspicious that there could be something going on, then the alcohol was included in the panel along with the other illegal substances that we would test for. So now what do? Right? So if you're in a state that has decriminalized recreational use, or they have legal use for medicinal purposes, or some mixed bag of both, how do you go about setting forth policies for your organization based on that information? A study, or a report rather, that came from Quest Diagnostics in April of this year said that they have seen positive tests hit a 14-year high for U.S. workers and job applicants, with marijuana leading the way. I don't think we're surprised. I just finished explaining about the whole pattern of how, timeline in terms of how things have been legalized. And so 14-year high, if you take us back to 14 years, that is 2004, right? So we're right in the midst of this 1996 with California legalizing the recreation and or decriminalizing rather, legalizing medical cannabis in 1996, and that pattern continued through 2012 until Colorado and Washington State made it legal to do recreational use of marijuana. So that's not really a surprise there that there's this pattern. And now states are, and I'm not sure if you've heard this, but San Francisco started, the city of San Francisco started, but states are also, and other cities are also following suit, where they're looking to actually ban marijuana testing from drug tests, period. Because how are we managing this exactly? If the federal level says that it's an illegal substance, but we have employees that have a medical license to use it, how do we manage that process? So to make it easier for employers, they're just taking it off the table altogether. Now, is that necessary? Is that really necessary to take it off the table? I think, in my professional opinion, and this is what I have advised my clients in the past, it's just like having a legal prescription for an opioid or an amphetamine or a barbiturate. If you have a legal prescription for it and you go to have your pre-employment drug screen done or your reasonable cause drug screen or what have you post-accident, and you have it test positive in your system for having marijuana, just like if it tested positive for the other substances I just mentioned, and you have a legal prescription for it, then technically you have a legal prescription for it. So we can't treat it as an issue as much as we could if you did not have a legal prescription for it. Okay, so that's the first thing. But let's just kind of think about, what that actually means in terms of how you go about doing your testing. The other thing is if they don't, and I've had employees call. So I set them up for their pre-employment drug screen. They call me when they get the registration and they say, I just need to let you know that I have a prescription for it. I'm probably going to test positive. And all I say to them is, as long as you can produce the legal prescription for it, then we should be good to go. There should not be an issue with that. But we have to have the legal prescription. Even though it's recreational in a lot of states, it makes it challenging for us when we know that it's a federal offense for it not to be recreational. So we have to go on the legal prescription route. Okay. And there are, so then you have some employers that get caught kind of in a trick bag because federal says no, but they're in a state that says yes. The federal says no, but they're in a state that says no unless it's medical. Federal says no, but they're in a state that says no unless it's a recreation. I mean, it gets to be a little bit challenging and convoluted. And I think that, in general, we need to employers need to know a few things. And so let's just go ahead and get into that. Number one, you need to know what your state law actually says, and whether, even though it's still considered a federal offense. So you do need to know what your state law states, what your state law says about recreational use or medicinal use of marijuana in your state. Number two, make sure that you review what your current policy says and evaluate your workforce. What do I mean by that? If I'm being totally honest, and I do not hide the truth from you guys in these podcasts, there are some industries that are, let's say, perceived to be more likely to use marijuana than other industries. I guess that's the best way that I can put it. So if you're in one of these industries, that it's a possibility that a large portion or a large population of your workforce may be using marijuana, you might need to just kind of evaluate that against what your state laws say, so that at least you go into making a decision about what to do next, eyes wide open, right? So make sure that you review your current policy. If you don't have a current policy, then you probably need to develop one, and you're going to develop it based on those same two factors: what your state law says, understanding that it's still a federal offense, and evaluating your current workforce. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3, consider making revisions on that state law. But when you think about making the revisions, think about your company workforce, of course, but also your company culture. That says a lot. And we've talked a lot over the last year and a half about how your values and your corporate culture create and attract and retain the type of brand image, employees that you want, or maybe those that you don't want. So think about how you can craft your policy. And I don't mean craft it meaning craft it to be deceitful, but how do you develop your policy that speaks to your organizational values and culture, attracts and retains the employees that you want, but still understands and has some level of flexibility, particularly if you're in a state, or specifically if you're in a state that has decriminalized it, legalized it for medical use, or has recreational use that is legal. All right. And then fourth, lastly, how about that? Lastly, you want to make sure that you are seeking HR guidance before you take any type of employment action or make any kind of employment decisions. The reason that I say this is because we have a federal law that could potentially impact how the states, even though the states have different laws, some states have different laws in the federal law as it relates to marijuana use. We do have a federal law, Americans with Disabilities Act, that may have some impact on how we treat employees that are under a legal prescription for medical marijuana. So we just have to think about that. And it really is just a conversation. We need to talk through all of the potential scenarios that we could possibly think of. Now, are we going to come up with everything? Probably not. But at least opening the door to have the conversation. So before you pull the trigger on someone that tests positive for marijuana on a pre-employment test and you decide not to hire them, unless that's the policy that you're going to follow and you're going to stick to that policy. And again, that's a conversation that needs to be had prior to, then you've got to be consistent with whatever the decision is that you're going to make. So it's really important that you do talk to an HR professional. You can talk to me and find out exactly what you're responsible for, what your responsibilities are, what the responsibilities are of the employee as well. And then marry that with, your corporate culture, your values, what the state law says, knowing that it's it's still not legal federally, but that it could be potentially coming down the pike. We just never know. So a lot of things are happening in the political realm where states are being allowed to make their own decisions with respect to certain things, and federal says, our federal law is this. So very similar to other laws and things that we've talked about over the past, FMLA is different based on the state that you live in. It's not the same. Federal says it's this. You can supplement that, but the minimum is this. So thinking about that and just kind of navigating that dark territory, because it's challenging for sure, but navigating that and making sure that you are being consistent, that you're being fair, equitable, and being considerate of the fact that we do have to kind of walk this thin line, tightrope situation as it relates to marijuana and the workplace. that is all I've got for you guys this evening. It was a lot. We kind of covered a lot of things. So I'm looking forward to, of course, joining you next month. Next month is August. Wow. I think Halloween decorations are probably going to be out by then. But, we're going to be coming down to the end of the summer. I've got some great topics coming up for you guys in August, September, and October. So make sure that you stay tuned. If you have not already subscribed to the podcast, we would love to have you do so. You can do that by going to www.hrpro4you.com/podcast. That will give you a pop-up form. You can fill in your information and get added to the podcast list. Make sure you tune in next month for our topic for next month. And, I try to keep it a surprise a little bit. I keep it in the dark until I don't need to keep it in the dark anymore, right? The element of surprise is pretty cool. I enjoy it anyway. So make sure that you stay tuned. And again, if you have not already subscribed to the podcast, you can do so. Don't forget also that corporate HR training is available for your organization. So if you're interested in doing that, drop me an email at slomax@hrpro4you.com. Let me know. We can have some conversations around getting your workforce trained on various corporate HR things. Sexual harassment is definitely one of them. It's still a pretty hot topic. It's in the forefront, but I can guarantee you that there's still a lot of dark corners that need to be navigated in that process. So corporate training around that is definitely something that's important. So if that's something that you're interested in or another topic, let's have a conversation. All right. I look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you again so much for spending these several minutes with me this evening as we talk about marijuana in the workplace. And I will see you next month. Have a great night. Bye-bye.